Hi, Dr. Pulsfer here to talk about what I'm going to call a lesson of history. Could the Mongols conquer Europe? No. And I'll explain why. There's a myth that if the Mongols had not had to return to Karakoram because of the death of the Khan, they would have conquered Europe. This statement has all kinds of flaws. It ignores logistics. It forgets the existence of many stone castles, especially as you moved west. It minimizes the defending forces. It overvalues the Mongol armies, and it ignores the sheer difficulties of great distances, which I'll now talk about in detail. Logistics. The Mongols depended heavily on horses. Each Mongol warrior had 5 to 10 horses that he took along so he could switch from one horse to another. And horses require large areas of grasslands. They didn't feed them grain, they fed them grass. Well, in Europe, there are no great grasslands, or there were not at the time. And of course, a lot of places have been cleared now. But at the time, there were no great grasslands farther west than Hungary, the Hungarian plain. Notice that the Avars and Magyars raided further west, but they always came back to Hungary. Even the Huns came back to Hungary. So the whole idea that the Mongols would have just ridden rampant over everybody from the point of view of logistics is nonsense. Now, I said there weren't lots of grasslands then. Salisbury Plain, where Stonehenge is all grass. But that was not true naturally. Naturally, it was a forest. And there were lots of places now in Europe that are grass, or more likely are farmland, that originally were natural forests. So, finally consider Napoleon's dictum: amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. The Mongols just didn't have the logistics to conquer Europe. What about castles? There were hundreds of castles all over Western Europe. France was a hodgepodge of what amounted to separate states because of castles. The king only controlled a small part of the country. It was too easy for his alleged or supposed vassals to just withdraw into their castles, and the king couldn't do much about it at all. And this in general contributed greatly to the fragmentation of all Western Europe. You know, we could talk about France or talk about Germany, but it was just, both of these were just hodgepodges of individual states. Even England, which was much more highly organized, was still a case where the individual barons could withdraw into their castles and thumb their noses at the king sometimes. And, of course, by Mongol times, these were large, strong stone castles, not the wooden ones of earlier centuries. Yes, the Mongols had a capability of besieging cities once their tail showed up with their Chinese engineers and so on, but there were way too many fortified cities and castles in Europe as you went west. Minimizing the defenders. The Mongols beat a small, hastily gathered group of Poles. They beat the Hungarians barely. And the Hungarians weren't exactly famous fighters. They were overrun by the Ottomans centuries later, so Hungary ceased to exist. And yet these were not even the strongest nations in Eastern Europe, but Byzantium was. So while the Europeans in general might not defeat the Mongols, they could certainly outlast them. Also, we're overvaluing the Mongols themselves. They were not invincible. It took them 50 plus years, much closer to home, to conquer Song China, which was South China. The Mongols had conquered North China long before they managed to finish, or to actually get into Song China. Once they got over the Yangtze, then they took it fairly rapidly. And of course in Song China there weren't castles There may have been a lack of grasslands, but they had the North Chinese grasslands to use. But again, the fighting was all along the Yangtze, and there were a lot of fleets involved in this. And when the Mongols finally took control of the Yangtze, the Song Chinese pretty much fell apart. They couldn't hold. Now, Mongols had tactical superiority if they fought in the open where horse archer tactics worked well. But these places were much less common in Europe than they were in Asia. Finally, we have sheer distances. The distance from Mongolia, the capital of Mongolia, to Paris, about 5,800 miles plus. From Mongolia to Guangzhou or Canton, which is in southern China, 1,700 miles plus. And yet it took them over 50 years to conquer southern China. Distance is an enormous problem from every point of view, especially in areas without sea transport and paved roads. So, the Mongol conquest of Europe is a fantasy of people who were looking at maps and who worship barbarian warriors. It's not a military reality. Thanks for listening.